Koreatown is where you belong, old man. That's what he said to me, in front of everyone. 90 seconds later, he was on his knees, begging his father, the man I saved from bleeding to death 40 years ago. He had no idea. But here's the part that will blow your mind. September in Los Angeles was still unbearably hot. 14 hours after leaving Incheon Airport, I stepped out of the LAX arrival gate and breathed in air that felt both familiar and foreign. The wind blowing through the palm trees carried the scent of ocean and exhaust, and that smell dragged memories from 40 years ago back to the surface. My name is Jae-ho Park. I am 72 years old. People call me a successful businessman. They think of me as an old man in Seoul, who owns a few buildings and lives off the rent. They're not wrong, but that's not all there is to me. This was my first time back in LA in 4 decades. The last time I left this city, I was 32. I had $300 in my pocket, and a chest full of wounds from failure. The day I abandoned my American dream and returned to Korea, I swore I would never set foot on this soil again. So why did I come back? A month ago I lost my wife. We had been together for 47 years. Her last words in that hospital bed still echo in my ears. She asked me if that restaurant was still there. That restaurant, the place where she and I first met. In 1983, at a shabby little place in Koreatown, a 23-year-old waitress locked eyes with a 28-year-old apprentice cook. That was us. I had heard that the tiny restaurant called Sunnyside had become the most famous fine dining establishment in LA. After I left, it passed through different owners and transformed into something completely different. I wanted to see it, the place where my memories with my wife began. Even if it had become unrecognizable, I hailed a taxi at the airport. The driver looked me over and nodded. My appearance must have seemed shabby. A worn jacket, comfortable pants, a beat-up suitcase. I dressed that way on purpose. It was comfortable. At my age, you stop caring about what others think. At least, that's what I thought. As we drove down Wilshire Boulevard, I gazed at the LA landscape through the window. It was a completely different city from 40 years ago. Skyscrapers pierced the sky and languages from every nation mingled and flowed through the streets. The taxi stopped in an upscale commercial district near Beverly Hills. I saw a sign with gold lettering that read Soleil, French for sun, I had been told. Had someone carried on the meaning I had given to Sunnyside 40 years ago? Or was it merely coincidence? I stepped out of the taxi and stood there for a moment, looking up at the building. The entire 5-story structure was a restaurant. The first floor was casual dining, the second floor, private rooms, the third floor a rooftop bar. The exterior was finished in marble, and at the entrance, valet parking attendants bustled about receiving guests' luxury vehicles. I walked slowly toward the main entrance. In the glass door, I caught my reflection. A wrinkled jacket, a hunched back, white hair. No matter how you looked at it, I was an old man who didn't belong in this glamorous place, but I told myself it didn't matter. I had only come to find memories. The moment I opened the door and stepped inside, a fragrant scent brushed my nose. Along with the air conditioning, the lobby was decorated like an art museum, with contemporary artworks displayed throughout. Light pouring from the chandelier, reflected off the marble floor and dazzled my eyes. And in that moment, I felt it. Dozens of gazes turning toward me, the questions and wariness and displeasure contained within those looks. Why is this shabby old man here? No one said it out loud, but I could hear the question clearly. When I stood before the reception desk, a young woman in a tailored suit looked up at me, blonde hair, blue eyes, flawless makeup. I felt her gaze sweep over my clothing. Her words were polite, but her voice already carried the nuance of refusal. She asked if I had a reservation. I did not. I had simply wanted to drop in, have a meal, and look around the place where my old memories lived. But my clumsy English seemed to make her even more displeased. I told her I had no reservation, that I just wanted to have lunch. She smiled. Only her lips curved upward while her eyes remained cold. She apologized and explained that they only accepted guests with reservations. Then she paused, looked me over once more, and added that the restaurant had a dress code. I understood perfectly what she meant. Someone like you doesn't belong here, please leave. I was about to nod and walk away. At my age, there was no pride worth defending, and I had no desire to create an unpleasant situation. That's when someone behind me raised their voice. They asked loudly if that old man was still there. I turned to see 2 white men sitting on the lobby sofa, snickering as they looked at me. They wore suits and expensive watches, clearly wealthy young men at first glance. One of them declared, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, wondering why Asians never knew their place. I felt heat rise in my chest. It wasn't anger, it was shame. In 72 years of life, had I ever been dismissed like this? Not because I was rich. As a human being, had I ever been treated like I was invisible? As I moved to leave, a tall, imposing black man entered through the front door. He had slicked back hair and a tailored suit, with a gold chain glinting at his neck. Several employees trailed behind him. The blonde receptionist jumped up and bowed when she saw him, greeting him as Manager Marcus. Her attitude was completely different from how she had treated me. The man called Marcus scanned the lobby and his eyes met mine. His brow furrowed. He asked who I was. The blonde receptionist answered in a small voice that I was a guest, who had come in without a reservation and was just leaving. Marcus approached me. His shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. I stood there and looked up at him. He was a full head taller than me. His words were polite, but his eyes were not. He told me this was a reservation-only restaurant and suggested I go to Koreatown, where I would find restaurants more suited to my taste. Koreatown. That word stabbed into my chest like a dagger. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. Should I reveal who I am? No, that would be too cowardly. And honestly, in that moment, I just wanted to leave, to suffer such humiliation in a place that held memories of my wife. As I lowered my head and turned to go, I saw a woman carrying a bucket walking from one side of the lobby. She was a black woman, looking to be in her late 50s, wearing a cleaning uniform. Her hands were wet, and sweat beaded on her forehead. Our eyes met, and she smiled. It was warm and genuine, a smile no one else had given me. In that moment, I stopped. The cleaning woman set down her bucket and approached me. Marcus, the manager, frowned, but she paid him no attention. She asked if I was all right, her voice low and gentle. It wasn't manufactured politeness. I could feel the sincerity coming from her heart. I nodded and told her I was fine, that I was just about to leave. She glanced around, then spoke in a quiet voice. She said I shouldn't stay here like this and invited me to come through the staff corridor, offering to give me a cup of warm tea in the kitchen. I hesitated. The situation was already embarrassing enough, and I didn't want to trouble this kind woman further. Marcus's sharp voice rang through the lobby. He called out her name, Rose, and demanded to know what she was doing. He told her to get back to cleaning, that dealing with guests wasn't her job. The woman called Rose flinched, but she turned and looked Marcus straight in the eye. She told him firmly that I was a guest, that this was someone who had entered their restaurant, and that they shouldn't treat a guest this way. Marcus scoffed and asked if she thought this was some neighborhood diner. He declared that without a reservation, you couldn't get in. Without meeting the dress code, you couldn't get in. Those were the rules. Rose bit her lip. I could see anger flickering in her eyes. But she was an employee, and Marcus was a manager. There were limits to what she could do. I placed my hand on Rose's shoulder, and told her it was all right, that I would leave. I thanked her for her kindness. Rose looked at me with eyes full of regret. She apologized sincerely and said this place wasn't usually like this. I smiled and told her I knew that she wasn't the one who made this place what it was. As I turned and walked toward the door, I heard Rose's voice behind me. She asked for my name. I didn't stop. I just answered as I walked. I told her my name was J.O. Park. Just as I was about to push through the glass door, I bumped into someone at the entrance. An apology came out of my mouth automatically. Looking up, I saw a white man who appeared to be in his early 60s. Silver hair, sharp eyes, a tailored suit. On his lapel was a gold pin engraved with the word Soleil. He asked if I was all right. His tone was polite, but his eyes held the same coldness I had seen in Marcus and the blonde receptionist. Marcus came running from inside and greeted him enthusiastically, calling him President Brian. The man called Brian nodded and entered the lobby. I slipped out through the gap. I stood on the street for a long time. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and wiped the sweat from my forehead. My hands were trembling, from anger, from shame, or from some indescribable mixture of both. I thought of my wife. 40 years ago, right here, we had laughed together, in that humble but heartwarming little restaurant, on quiet afternoons with no customers. We would secretly dance. I could still hear her laughter echoing in my ears. But now, this place. I took out my worn wallet from my pocket. In the inner compartment was an old business card, faded and dog-eared, 40 years old. Sunnyside Restaurant. Owner J.O. Park. Established 1981. That's right. This building was mine, or more precisely, even after I left, I never sold it. I'd only leased it through a property management company. The ownership was still in my name. The annual rent had been donated to a scholarship foundation, under my wife's name, and no one knew. I put the business card back in my wallet. My original plan had been to quietly reminisce and leave, but what I had seen in there wouldn't leave my mind. The mocking guests, the cold-eyed employees, the arrogant manager, and amid all of that, one cleaning woman named Rose, who tried to preserve warmth. I took out my phone and made a call. My secretary in Seoul answered. I told her to fly to LA immediately, and to bring every document related to the Soleil restaurant, the lease agreement, the building registration, everything. 2 hours later, I sat in a nearby cafe, staring at a laptop screen. As I reviewed the documents my secretary had sent, I pieced together the current situation of Soleil Restaurant. General Manager Brian West, 61 years old, he had joined as an investor when this restaurant reopened as Soleil 30 years ago, then acquired operational rights and had been running it ever since. Manager Marcus West, 38 years old, Brian's son. In that moment, I felt my heart stop. Marcus West, 38 years old. I did the math quickly, born in 1986. Which meant, a memory surfaced, a winter night in 1985. That night, I had closed the restaurant and was walking home. Passing through a back alley in Koreatown, I heard screaming from the end of the alley. When I ran to look, a young white man lay on the ground, bleeding. He appeared to have been robbed. The knife wound was deep, and he was barely conscious. I loaded him into my car and raced to the hospital. The doctor told me that if I had been 30 minutes later, he would have died. That man's name was Brian West. He was 30 years old at the time, a young businessman just beginning to find success in real estate investment. He told me he would never forget that. I had saved his life and asked for my contact information, but I refused. Saving someone's life didn't require compensation. I just told him to go on his way and live healthy. That was the last I saw of him. And now, I stared at the laptop screen again. Brian West, that very same man, was now the general manager of this restaurant. And his son Marcus had thrown me out. If there was such a thing as fate, could there be a more remarkable coincidence? I smiled bitterly. If I had just walked past Brian that night, he would have died in that alley. Marcus would never have been born, and there would have been no one to insult me today. But so what? That didn't justify today's humiliation. Just then the cafe door opened and someone walked in. It was Rose. Instead of her cleaning uniform, she wore casual clothes, with a worn bag over her shoulder. It must have been the end of her shift. I raised my hand to call her. She turned, recognized me, and her eyes went wide. She rushed over, asking if I was all right. Apologizing profusely, worried that she had made things worse for me. I shook my head and told her I was fine. I invited her to sit and offered to buy her a cup of coffee. Rose hesitated, then sat across from me. I asked how long she had worked at Soleil. 12 years, she answered. 12 years, a long time. I asked if it was a good workplace. Rose smiled bitterly. She said the pay was decent, but pointed out that I had seen what it was like earlier. She said it wasn't the first or second time something like that had happened. Anyone whose clothes looked shabby, whose English was clumsy, whose skin color was different, they all received the same treatment. I asked if that was why she had stepped forward. Rose nodded. She said she had received that treatment herself. Being a black woman in this country wasn't easy, so when she saw someone else being treated that way, she couldn't just walk past. I watched her quietly. Someone who had worked in that cold place for 12 years, without losing her warmth. Someone who tried to do the right thing even in the face of power. I asked if she would mind me asking one more question. She said to go ahead. I asked what she would change, if that restaurant could be completely transformed. Rose thought for a moment before answering. She mentioned hearing old stories about how that building used to be a small Korean restaurant called Sunny Side. Back then, anyone in the neighborhood could come eat there, regardless of whether they were rich or poor. She said she wished it could return to being a place like that. I felt my heart pound. She continued, saying that of course it was impossible. President Brian would never allow something like that. I set down my coffee cup and spoke. I asked her one more thing. She waited. I asked if she would believe me if I told her I was the owner of that restaurant. Rose laughed. She thought I was joking, but I wasn't smiling. The next afternoon at 3 o'clock, I stood before Soleil restaurant once again, but this time was different from yesterday. I wore a tailored suit, and my shoes gleamed. My hair was neatly groomed. Behind me stood my secretary and lawyer, who had rushed from Seoul holding document bags, and in my inner breast pocket was that 40-year-old business card. When I entered through the front door, the blonde receptionist who had turned me away yesterday came running. She began to ask if I had a reservation, but her words cut off mid-sentence. She recognized me, but her expression showed complete confusion, and my entirely different appearance from yesterday. I told her the same thing, that I had no reservation, but I added that today I had come to meet the general manager, Brian West. The blonde receptionist's face hardened. She began to say apologetically that the president wasn't available without an appointment. I told her to give him a message, to tell him that the person who saved his life in a Koreatown back alley in the winter of 1985 had come. The receptionist's eyes went wide. She clearly didn't understand what that meant, but she seemed to sense something was very wrong. 5 minutes later, Brian West came down to the lobby personally. His face showed a mixture of bewilderment and wariness. We faced each other. He was no longer the young man of 40 years ago, and I was no longer the young man I had been either. He asked politely who I was. I pulled the old business card from my breast pocket. I told him my name was J.O. Park, and that 40 years ago, I went by J.O. Park in English. The color drained from Brian's face. He took the business card. His hands trembled slightly as he read the faded letters. He muttered in disbelief, asking if it was really me, if I was really that person from back then. I nodded. I confirmed that I was the one who took him to the hospital 40 years ago, and then I took the documents from my secretary and held them out to Brian. I told him I was also the owner of this building. The lobby froze. The blonde receptionist stood with her mouth hanging open. Marcus, who had appeared belatedly, stood beside his father without grasping the situation. Marcus asked what was happening. He looked at me and frowned, asking if I wasn't that person from yesterday. Brian's voice dropped low. He told Marcus to shut up. Marcus's face went white. His expression showed he had never heard his father speak to him that way. Brian looked at me. Complex emotions swirled in his eyes. He said he had searched for me for 40 years. Ever since that night, he had looked for me. He wanted to repay his benefactor, but he couldn't find me. All he knew was that I had returned to Korea. I didn't respond. Brian continued. He said he couldn't believe this building had been mine all along. He asked what had happened here yesterday. I looked at Marcus, the man who had told me yesterday to go to Koreatown, who had no idea he was insulting his father's savior. I addressed Brian and spoke slowly. I told him that yesterday, I had been treated like a beggar in this restaurant, because my English was clumsy and my clothes were worn. I was mocked by guests and ignored by staff, and his son told me I didn't know my place. Brian's face contorted. He asked Marcus if this was true. Marcus's lips moved, but no words came out. I continued. But one person was different, I said. A cleaning woman named Rose approached me and asked if I was all right. She offered to give me warm tea, even while being scolded by Marcus. Brian closed his eyes. He murmured something about what had he done. At that moment there was movement from one side of the lobby. Rose stood there with her mop bucket. She had been watching this situation from a distance. When our eyes met, surprise and confusion crossed her face. She must have remembered what I said at the cafe yesterday. If I told you I was the owner of that restaurant, would you believe me? The joke she thought I was making had been real. I nodded toward Rose. Then I spoke to Brian. I told him I hadn't come for revenge. When I saved him 40 years ago, it wasn't because I wanted compensation. I did it because he was a person, that was all. Brian lifted his head. His eyes were glistening. But, I said, lowering my voice, I told him my wife had passed away 3 weeks ago. The place where I first met her was right here at Sunnyside 40 years ago. I had come looking for those memories. But what I found instead, I looked around the lobby, the cold marble, the grand chandelier, and the staff still frozen in shock. The spirit of the warm restaurant I had created was nowhere to be found. Silence fell. Marcus stepped forward. His face showed a mixture of anger and shame. He told us to wait. He asked his father if he really believed everything this person was saying. He demanded to know how anyone could prove something from 40 years ago. He questioned the sudden appearance claiming to be the building owner. Brian cut off his son, telling him to stop. Marcus protested, calling to his father. Brian's voice rang sharp, repeating his command to stop. He told Marcus he still didn't understand the situation. He explained that I had saved his life 40 years ago. I was the one who took him to the hospital when he lay bleeding from a knife wound. He said the debt had weighed on his heart his entire life. And then today, I had come here. And did Marcus know what he had done? Marcus's face went pale. Brian's voice cracked as he spelled it out. Marcus had treated his father's savior like a beggar and thrown him out. The person Brian had searched for over the past 40 years. In that person's building. In the restaurant that person had created. Marcus took a step back. Everything was finally connecting for him. He stammered that he hadn't known. Brian laughed coldly. He said the only thing Marcus hadn't known was who I was, but his behavior had been wrong regardless of who I was. He asked if it was right to disrespect someone, just because their clothes were old and their English was clumsy. Marcus bit his lip. He couldn't answer. I watched the father and son quietly, the young man who lay bleeding 40 years ago. He had grown up and built this big business, but somewhere along the way, he seemed to have lost something, and that loss had been passed on to his son. I called Brian's name. I told him I hadn't come to blame him. People change. I wasn't the same person I was 40 years ago either. Brian looked at me. He asked what I wanted. Then, I looked around the lobby for a moment. A crowd had gathered before I noticed. Guests, employees, everyone was watching this strange scene unfold. I even saw the young men in suits who had laughed at me yesterday. I spoke slowly. I told Brian I would continue to lease him this building. I wouldn't change the contract terms either. A flicker of hope appeared in Brian's eyes. However, I said, I told him I had conditions. He said he would do anything. I looked at Marcus. First, I said, his son must step down from his position as manager. He was not qualified to hold a position that required dealing with people. Marcus's face flushed red. And, I continued, looking at the blonde receptionist. I said the employee who tried to turn me away yesterday must receive retraining. If she had learned to judge guests by their appearance, she now needed to learn to forget that. The receptionist lowered her head. Second, I said, looking at Rose, I asked Brian to appoint her as Chief Customer Service Officer. After 12 years of working at this restaurant, she knew better than anyone how to treat people with warmth, whether someone was a janitor, a waiter, or a manager. The title didn't matter. What mattered was the heart that treated people as people. Rose's eyes went wide. She asked if I meant her. I smiled. I reminded her that yesterday she had told me she wished Sunnyside could become a place where anyone could come comfortably. I told her to make that dream herself. Tears streamed down Rose's face. Brian bowed his head. He said he understood and would follow all my conditions. I raised my hand, signaling I wasn't finished. Third, and this is my last condition, I said. Everyone held their breath. I asked for a small space to be created in one corner of this restaurant, to be named the Young Heat Park Corner. Brian looked puzzled and repeated the name. I told him it was my wife's name. I felt my chest grow heavy. 40 years ago, she was a young woman who worked as a waitress here. I washed dishes in the kitchen while she carried meals to customers. On quiet afternoons with no guests, we would secretly dance together. My voice trembled. I told him her last words before she left. This world were asking if this restaurant still existed. That was why I had come. I wanted to preserve at least a little of the time she missed so much. The lobby fell completely silent. I continued. I asked that photos from Sunnyside 40 years ago be hung in that corner, and that anyone who came there hungry but without money be given a free meal. I would cover the cost. Tears fell from Brian's eyes. He promised solemnly that he would make it happen. I nodded. Finally, I looked at the young men who had laughed at me yesterday. I told them they had laughed at me yesterday. They had asked why Asians never knew their place. Their faces turned ghostly white. I told them I wasn't angry. I asked them to remember just one thing. The habit of judging people by their appearance would someday come back to them. They would grow old too. They might go somewhere where their English was clumsy, or they might lose their money. I asked them to think about how they would want to be treated then. In the silence, I turned to leave. That's when someone started clapping. It was Rose, tears streaming down her face. She was bringing her hands together with all her strength. One person, then another, and the applause spread. Employees, guests, one by one they stood and clapped. Beneath the chandelier, in the light, pouring down, the sound echoed through the lobby. I smiled. What would my wife have said if she were watching? She probably would have said something like this. Honey, you overdid it a bit. I could hear her voice in my ear. I looked up at the sky and murmured quietly, I told her it was all because of her. 6 months later, I returned to LA once more. Soleil restaurant had changed considerably. The exterior was the same, but stepping inside, it felt different. Still elegant, but somehow warmer. And in one corner of the first floor, the Young-hee Park corner had been created as promised. Old black and white photographs hung on the wall, images of Sunnyside from 40 years ago. A young man and woman smiling in front of a small restaurant. That was my wife and me. Below the photos was a small sign, a warm meal for anyone who is hungry. I stood there for a long time, gazing at it. A voice came from behind me addressing me as Chairman Park. I turned to find Rose standing there. In 6 months, she had completely transformed. Instead of a cleaning uniform, she wore a neat suit, and on her chest was a badge reading Chief Customer Service Officer, but her smile was the same as ever, warm and genuine. She asked if I had been well. I nodded. I asked how she was doing in her new position. Rose laughed. She admitted she was scared at first, wondering what she really knew. But now she felt good knowing there was something she could do, making everyone who came here feel welcome. That was her job. I smiled. I told her if my wife had been alive, she would have really liked Rose. Tears welled in Rose's eyes. She said my wife's photo was so beautiful. She said she could feel how much we must have loved each other. Every time she looked at it, I gazed at the photograph on the wall again, the youngest from 40 years ago, back when we feared nothing in the world. I called Rose's name. She answered. I thanked her. Rose tilted her head, asking what for. I explained that 6 months ago, when she approached me, I had actually been very worn down. After losing my wife, becoming alone, everything had felt meaningless. But when she asked if I was all right, I suddenly felt overwhelmed. Rose blinked. She asked if that was really how I felt. I confirmed it. I told her that someone was seeing me. After being treated like I was invisible, meeting someone who genuinely worried about me, I learned how significant that was. Tears flowed from Rose's eyes. She pulled me into an embrace. She thanked me too for giving her a chance, for changing her life. I patted her back. I told her we had changed each other. She had given me hope, and I had given her an opportunity. That was how the world worked. Sunlight poured in through the window. When my wife and I first locked eyes in this spot 40 years ago, had the sunshine been like this? I looked at my wife's photograph and murmured quietly. I told her she must be watching. The warmth she had missed so much had returned here. I said I felt like I could go now, to be by her side. My heart felt peaceful. In 72 years of life, I had gained much and lost much. I had succeeded and failed. I had loved and said goodbye, but what remained in the end was the warmth between human hearts, the courage to approach someone without judging them, the simple act of reaching out to ask a question, "Are you all right?" That was the first step to changing the world. I learned that in Los Angeles that day. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness creates the greatest change. Rose didn't know that day that I was a billionaire. She didn't know I was the building owner, or the founder of that restaurant. She simply approached an elderly man who looked like he was struggling, without expecting compensation, without calculating what she might gain, simply because he was a person. About you, when you see someone being ignored, do you just walk past, or do you approach them and ask, "Are you all right?" That one question can change someone's life, just like it changed mine today. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, when have you experienced kindness from a stranger, or when have you been the first to reach out to someone? Thank you for watching. Have a warm day.